In the heart of a bustling morning at a small-town diner, the air carried the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. At a cozy booth by the window, Danielle Carter shared a quiet moment with her 8-year-old daughter. Mia, the sunlight streamed through the glass, painting golden highlights across Mia's face as she carefully maneuvered a piece of pancake onto her fork, her braids swaying with each tilt of her head. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of curiosity only a child could hold, brimming with questions and uncontained excitement. "Mommy, when's Daddy coming home?" she asked, her voice a melody of innocence and anticipation. Danielle, cradling a warm mug of coffee, set it down with a gentle smile, her fingers lingering on the ceramic handle. "Daddy's got a big day ahead." "Sweetheart, he's starting his new job today," she replied, her tone laced with a quiet pride that had been growing ever since her husband, Marcus, received the life-changing call. Mia's face lit up, her small frame straightening as she leaned forward, hands pressing eagerly against the table's edge. "His promotion?" she asked, as if the word itself held magic. Danielle nodded, drizzling a touch more syrup onto Mia's plate before meeting her daughter's gaze. "That's right. He's the boss now," she said, her lips curving into a knowing smile that hinted at the weight of this milestone, a victory not just for Marcus, but for their family. Mia giggled, her spoon tapping lightly against her plate as her feet swung beneath the table. A playful habit she hadn't outgrown. "Does that mean he gets to tell everybody what to do?" she asked, her voice bubbling with delight. Danielle's laughter was soft, her head shaking gently. "It means he's got a lot of responsibility," she corrected, her words patient but firm. "He'll be busier, but at home, he's still just Daddy." Mia's brows furrowed for a moment, her young mind turning over the idea before she broke into a wide grin. "I bet he's going to be the best boss ever," she declared, her confidence unwavering. Danielle's heart warmed, her hand reaching across the table to tuck a stray braid behind Mia's ear. "I think so too. Baby," she murmured, her gaze softening with love. The diner's door swung open with a sharp jingle, and the atmosphere shifted. Officer Travis Mitchell stepped inside, his presence casting a shadow that didn't need to be loud to be felt. Conversations at nearby tables faltered, the clink of silverware suddenly sharper against the hum of morning chatter. Danielle didn't turn, but she sensed it, the subtle tension that followed Mitchell like a storm cloud. His eyes landed on her table, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. But it wasn't warm. It was cold, calculating, the kind of look that sized someone up and dismissed them in the same breath. His jaw tightened, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as if her mere presence in the diner was an inconvenience. Danielle remained unfazed, her posture steady, her focus on Mia unbroken. She lifted her coffee mug again, her expression calm, refusing to give him even a glance. Mia, blissfully unaware of the silent exchange, pressed on with her questions. "Do you think Daddy's nervous?" she asked, her voice bright, cutting through the undercurrent like a ray of light. Danielle stirred her coffee slowly, picturing Marcus that morning adjusting his tie, squaring his shoulders, taking a deep breath before stepping into his new role as chief of police. "Maybe a little," she admitted with a smile, "but he's worked hard for this. He's ready." Mia nodded, satisfied, and returned to her pancakes, oblivious to the fact that Mitchell's gaze hadn't wavered. He stood across the room, still watching, still deciding, his presence a quiet weight pressing against the edges of their moment. Danielle caught a glimpse of his reflection in the diner's large window, the blur of his uniform cutting through the soft morning scene. She didn't need to look to know he was lingering, his attention deliberate, but she refused to let it disrupt her. Mia, meanwhile, had mastered cutting her pancake into perfect little squares, her face beaming with pride as she speared one with her fork. "Look, Mommy, I'm getting so good at this," she exclaimed, her feet kicking lightly beneath the table. Danielle's smile widened. "You sure are, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm with encouragement. Mia reached for her juice, her excitement still bubbling from their talk about her father's new role. "I bet Daddy's not nervous at all," she said confidently, taking a bite of pancake. I bet he's already telling everyone what to do. Danielle chuckled, shaking her head. He's probably just getting settled in, she said, lifting her mug. It's a big job, but he's ready for it. Mia nodded as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. But as she reached for her napkin, her elbow grazed the edge of her juice glass. The moment unfolded in a flash, the glass wobbled, juice sloshing toward the table's edge. Mia lunged to catch it, her small shoulder bumping squarely into Mitchell, who had just stepped closer to their table. Hot coffee splashed across Mitchell's uniform, the dark liquid seeping into the fabric. For a heartbeat, the diner seemed to hold its breath. The hum of conversation didn't stop, but the air grew heavy with unspoken awareness, glances darting toward the scene. Mia's eyes widened, her face frozen in a mix of shock and guilt as she looked up at the officer, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Danielle was already in motion, grabbing a napkin, her voice steady as she turned to her daughter. "It's okay, baby. It was an accident," she said, her tone calm but firm. Mitchell, however, wasn't focused on the spill. His eyes locked onto Mia, his jaw tight, his posture radiating an authority that had no place being aimed at a child. His expression wasn't outright anger, but something uglier, restrained, deliberate, a look that carried an edge meant to intimidate. Danielle saw it instantly, her instincts kicking in as Mia stood there, napkin clutched in her small hands, her eyes uncertain. Mitchell's lips curled into a faint, condescending smirk. "Well," he drawled, brushing off his sleeve with exaggerated slowness, "guess I should have known better than to walk by a table like this." Danielle's fingers tightened around the napkin, a cold resolve settling in her chest. She exhaled slowly, keeping her voice smooth as she addressed Mia first. "Go ahead and sit down, sweetheart. It's just coffee. No big deal." Mia hesitated, her gaze flickering between her mother and the officer, but Danielle's reassuring nod gave her the courage to sit. Only then did Danielle turn to Mitchell, her posture composed, her tone light but laced with steel. "She's a kid," she said simply, her voice even. No trace of apology. "It was an accident." Mitchell made a low sound, not quite a laugh but dripping with dismissal. He grabbed a napkin from his belt, dabbing at his uniform with theatrical flair, before glancing at Mia. "Sure," he said, his tone heavy with insinuation, "but I guess when no one teaches them how to behave, accidents happen." The words landed like a slap, their meaning clear, having nothing to do with spilled coffee and everything to do with the assumptions he'd already made about them. The diner grew quieter, the tension palpable. Though no one openly acknowledged it, Danielle's breath was slow, controlled, her fingers resting lightly on the table, her eyes locked on Mitchell's. "I'm sorry, what was that?" she asked, her voice still calm but now carrying a razor-sharp edge, a challenge woven into every syllable. She wasn't just any woman, and she wasn't about to let this slide. Unbeknownst to Mitchell, Danielle was the wife of Marcus Carter, the new chief of police, his new boss. And this moment, this fleeting display of unchecked power, was about to unravel in ways he couldn't imagine. In the quiet hum of the diner, Mitchell's lips curled into a faint, knowing smirk, his head tilting ever so slightly as he savored the moment. This was his favorite part, the push, the delicate dance of testing boundaries, of seeing just how far he could stretch the tension before it snapped. His eyes glinted with a subtle challenge as he let out a low, mocking chuckle, shaking his head like he was in on some private joke. Finally, he locked eyes with Danielle, his gaze steady, piercing. "Relax," he said, his voice dropping into a deceptively casual tone, as if the words were weightless, harmless. "I was just saying, sometimes these things happen when there's no—" He paused, letting the silence linger just long enough to make her feel the unspoken sting, father around. The words hit like a carefully aimed dart, quiet, precise, deliberate. Not loud, not aggressive, but sharp enough to slice through the air. The diner's atmosphere shifted instantly, the quiet buzz of clinking forks and murmured conversations seeming to fade as something taut and unspoken stretched between them. Danielle sat across from him, her expression unreadable but her posture stiffening just enough to betray the impact. She absorbed the implication, the weight of it ringing louder than if he'd raised his voice. Beside her, it born little Mia, too young to fully grasp the undercurrent, sensed the shift. Her small fingers tightened around the edge of the table, hesitant, uncertain, her wide eyes darting between her mother and the man standing before them. Danielle drew a slow, deliberate breath, her movements measured, controlled, like someone refusing to be rattled. Mitchell watched her closely, his smirk lingering as he waited for her reaction, fully aware of the line he'd just crossed. He knew exactly what he was doing, and Danielle knew exactly what she was going to do next. This wasn't going to slide, not here, not now. You know, she began, her voice light on the surface but laced with an unmistakable edge. I was really hoping I misheard you just now, because you're not seriously standing in the middle of this diner, talking to a child's mother, implying something you have no business even thinking about. Are you? Mitchell's smirk widened, just enough to be noticed, his posture shifting as he rolled his shoulders, settling into the moment like someone relishing a game. He was testing her, prodding for a crack in her composure, seeing how far he could push before she pushed back. Oh, come on, he said, raising his hands in a mock gesture of innocence, his tone dripping with condescension. I was just making an observation. No need to get all worked up. Danielle's jaw tightened, a flicker of tension breaking through her calm facade as she exhaled sharply through her nose. It was the way he said it, the way he twisted the narrative, making it sound like she was overreacting, like she was the one creating the problem. It was a tactic she'd seen before, the kind of baiting that pushed just far enough so that when someone finally snapped, they were painted as the issue. You weren't making an observation, she said, her voice dropping slightly, carrying a quiet intensity that made him pause. You were making an assumption, and not just about me. She leaned forward just a fraction, her eyes never leaving his. You were making an assumption about my daughter, a child, and you did it because you thought you could get away with it, because you thought no one would call you out. For the briefest moment, something flickered across Mitchell's face, irritation, maybe, or the sudden realization that she wasn't going to back down. It was gone as quickly as it came. But Danielle caught it, and in that instant, the balance of power shifted. The diner grew quieter still, the tension no longer just a private undercurrent, but a palpable force that drew the attention of the few patrons nearby. They didn't look directly, didn't dare insert themselves, but their eyes lingered, their movements slowing as they became unwilling witnesses to the unfolding scene. Mitchell adjusted his stance, his fingers brushing the edge of his belt, grazing the holster at his hip. It wasn't a threat, not overtly, but it was deliberate, a subtle reminder of his authority, meant to intimidate. Danielle's gaze flicked down to the movement, then back up, her expression utterly unimpressed. Beside her, Mia shifted uncomfortably, her small hands clutching her napkins so tightly it crumpled under her grip. Danielle saw it from the corner of her eye, the way her daughter's breathing grew shallow, cautious, and it lit a fire in her chest. This wasn't going to happen, not in front of her child. You know what's funny, Danielle said, tilting her head slightly, her voice quieter now but carrying a steely resolve. Just this morning, I was telling Mia about her father, about how he's stepping into a new role, how he's worked so hard to get where he is. She let the words hang in the air, deliberate. Knowing Mitchell had no idea who her husband was, knowing his smugness was built on ignorance. She watched as he barely suppressed an eye roll, shifting his weight as if he'd already dismissed her. Sure, he muttered, his voice low, bored, dripping with that same condescending tone. Danielle let out a slow, thoughtful hum, undeterred. It's interesting, she continued, ignoring his attempt to brush her off. The way you said that just now, that little remark about a father not being around, it wasn't an accident. Was it, Officer Mitchell? His mouth twitched, but she didn't stop. The way I see it, you walked into this diner, saw me sitting here with my daughter, and you made a choice. You didn't have to say anything. You didn't have to assume anything, but you did. Because you thought it would go unchecked. Mitchell's smirk faltered, just for a moment, his composure slipping as the confidence he'd worn so easily began to fray. He didn't like this, didn't like being called out, didn't like that she was holding her ground. Danielle saw it, and she made sure he knew she saw it. Mia, still watching, glanced between them, her small frame tense as she tried to make sense of the shifting energy. Mitchell, now fully aware he was losing control of the conversation, let out a sharp exhale, forcing a low chuckle. Well, he said, straightening, tugging at his belt with an exaggerated motion. Seems like someone's a little sensitive this morning. Danielle smiled then, but it wasn't a smile of amusement or retreat. It was the smile of someone who'd already decided she wasn't done. Oh, no. Officer, she said, her voice softer now but heavier, laced with quiet power. I'm just making an observation. The diner was dead silent now, the weight of her words settling over the room like a storm cloud. Mitchell's jaw ticked, his eyes narrowing as he met her unflinching gaze. He wasn't used to this someone refusing to shrink, someone turning his own tactics back on him. You know, he started, his voice carrying the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. This right here, this attitude, this is why y'all always have problems with the law. Danielle heard Mia's sharp intake of breath before anything else. A small, instinctive sound that cut through her like a blade. She felt something tighten in her chest. A familiar, bitter anger at the way he'd said it, not with overt malice, but with a smooth, casual certainty, as if it were a universal truth. That was what made it worse. The way he spoke it like it was fact, like it was so ingrained in his worldview that it didn't even need emphasis. She inhaled slowly, exhaled just as evenly, refusing to give him the reaction he was fishing for. Instead, she studied him, her gaze sharp and unyielding, like she was seeing straight through to the core of who he was. Oh, she murmured, tilting her head slightly. And what exactly do you mean by y'all? Mitchell's smirk returned, wider now, pleased with himself. You know, he said lightly, relishing the moment. The ones who always think they don't have to follow the rules. The ones who love to play victim when the consequences come knocking. Danielle felt Mia shift beside her, her daughter's hands gripping the napkin so tightly now that it was tearing at the edges. She knew that later. She'd have to sit Mia down, hold her close, reassure her that this wasn't her fault, that she didn't have to carry the weight of this moment. But right now, she had to handle this. She leaned forward slightly, her forearms resting on the table, her voice calm but laced with a quiet, unshakable strength. You know, she said, her eyes locked on his. I was planning on just having a nice breakfast with my daughter this morning, but you walked in here, saw us sitting here, and decided that wasn't going to happen. So now I'm curious. She lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. What exactly is your problem? Mitchell's smirk faltered again, a quick, fleeting crack in his composure. He hadn't expected her to stay so composed, to turn the spotlight back on him. His fingers flexed against his belt, his posture shifting as he tried to reclaim the authority he was used to wielding. My problem, he repeated, his voice carrying a sharper edge now. Lady, I don't have a problem. You do. Danielle felt the moment twist, the air growing heavier as his badge caught the light, a silent reminder of the power he thought he held. But she wasn't intimidated. She leaned back slightly, her expression calm, resolute, and in that moment, she knew she'd already won. The air in Mel's diner hung heavy, thick with tension that seemed to cling to every surface. Danielle sat at the worn wooden table, her fingers resting lightly on its edge, her posture calm but alert. Beside her, Mia, her 8-year-old daughter, pressed closer, her small body seeking the quiet comfort of her mother's presence. The faint hum of conversation from other patrons and the clink of dishes behind the counter filled the space, but it all felt distant, muted, as if the world had narrowed to the confrontation unfolding at their table. Officer Mitchell stood across from them, his stance wide, his voice dripping with something sharper than condescension, a warning wrapped in smug authority. His words had started as barbs, casual jabs meant to provoke, but now they carried a darker edge. "See, this is what I'm talking about," he said, his head shaking with a mocking chuckle, as if the situation were nothing more than a minor annoyance in his day. "You people love to make a scene, don't you? Always playing the victim the second someone calls you out. And when things don't go your way, you cry about it. Same old story." Danielle felt the room shift. A sharp inhale came from the diner's owner behind the counter, and a man in a nearby booth fidgeted, his discomfort palpable. But no one spoke. No one ever did. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let Mitchell's words burrow into her, wouldn't let them take root and cloud her judgment. That's what he wanted: an outburst, a reason to escalate. His hand lingered near his belt, fingers brushing the edge of his radio, waiting for her to give him an excuse. Before she could respond, before she could choose whether to dismantle him with carefully measured words or let him stew in his own venom, Mitchell leaned in, his smile bright, arrogant, triumphant. Then again, he said, his tone as casual as if he were commenting on the weather, "I guess I shouldn't be surprised. No father around, no real discipline. No wonder the kid's already a problem." The words landed like a blow, cold and sharp, settling into Danielle's chest. Beside her, Mia froze, her bright, too observant eyes flickering with something too heavy for a child her age. The diner fell silent, the kind of quiet that swallows sound and amplifies every heartbeat. Danielle rose to her feet, her movement smooth, deliberate, unhurried. She didn't slam her chair back or raise her voice. She refused to give him the reaction he craved. Instead, she placed both hands on the table, leaning forward just enough to meet his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding, her presence a quiet force that filled the room. "That," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying a power that no shout could match, "is the last thing you're going to say about my child." Mitchell's smirk held, but his body betrayed him a subtle shift, a tightening in his shoulders. He tilted his head, his voice drawling with false bravado. "Or what, you gonna throw a tantrum? 'Cause a disturbance? Make me do my job." Danielle's lips curved, not into a smile but something sharper, something that said she saw through him. "No," she said, her tone smooth as glass, watching the faint twitch of his fingers. "You're going to do that all on your own." His jaw ticked, a fleeting crack in his composure. Then, as she knew he would, he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice laced with a practiced calm that was all performance, designed to shape the story before anyone else could. "I've got a disorderly individual at Mel's Diner, female, black, mid-30s, refusing to comply with law enforcement directives. Possible escalation in progress." Danielle exhaled slowly, her hand still on the table, her posture unshaken. He wanted fear, submission, a reaction to justify his actions. She wouldn't give him any of it. "Escalation," she repeated, tilting her head slightly, her voice carrying the same controlled edge. "That would imply there's a threat here. Officer, I think we both know who's trying to escalate this." Mitchell's smirk faltered, just for a moment, replaced by a flicker of frustration. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly, so calmly. He stepped closer, his frame looming as if sheer presence could intimidate her. "Oh, I see what you're doing," he said, his voice tightening. "You think if you keep your voice all nice and calm, act like you're in control, people will believe you. But I've got news for you, lady. I'm the one with the badge. I decide how this ends." Danielle's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. "You think that badge makes you untouchable," she said, her voice softer now, but laced with a quiet intensity that cut through the air. "That's the problem, isn't it? You think it gives you the right to say whatever you want, treat people however you want." He snorted, shaking his head. "Spare me the lecture, sweetheart. I know how this goes. You'll stand there, act all righteous, pretend you didn't bring this on yourself. Then, when you're cuffed and in the back of my car, you'll cry about how it's unfair." Danielle's breath was steady, her gaze unwavering. She'd heard it all before: the baiting, the taunts, the attempt to push her into a corner. "And when exactly did I break the law?" "Officer," she asked, her tone calm but pointed. "Was it when I ordered breakfast? When I sat at my table? When I refused to let you insult me in front of my daughter?" Mitchell's smirk vanished, his patience fraying. "When you refused to follow orders," he snapped, his voice sharp now, no longer hiding its edge. "You're disturbing the peace, and I don't have to explain myself to you." Mia's small fingers brushed against Danielle's sleeve, hesitant, uncertain. The touch was a reminder of who was watching, of what was at stake. Danielle turned her head just enough to meet her daughter's nervous eyes. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but firm, holding the moment together despite the weight pressing down on them. "It's okay. I need you to be brave for me. All right?" Mitchell rolled his eyes, scoffing. "Oh, give me a break." Before he could say more, a movement from the corner of the diner caught Danielle's attention. Lisa, a waitress who'd worked at Mel's for years, stepped forward. Her face was tight, her movements brisk, but her eyes held something: unspoken solidarity, perhaps, or quiet defiance. "I'll take her," Lisa said, her voice quick but steady. She reached a hand toward Mia. "Come on, sweetheart. You can wait in the back." Danielle's chest tightened, but she nodded. Mia hesitated, her fingers clutching her mother's sleeve, her breath uneven. "It's okay, baby," Danielle said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze, her voice a lifeline. "Go with Miss Lisa." Mia's eyes searched her mother's face, looking for reassurance, for safety. Danielle gave a small nod, and after a moment, Mia let go, her small hands slipping into Lisa's. As they walked toward the back, Mia glanced over her shoulder, her young face carrying a worry no child should know. Danielle held her composure, even as her heart ached at the sight. The moment Mia disappeared, Mitchell moved. His hand closed around Danielle's wrist, sharp, sudden, authoritative. Her gaze snapped to him, meeting his eyes as he spoke, his voice heavy with the power he thought was his. "You just made this a whole lot harder on yourself." And then it happened, the cold click of handcuffs locking around her wrists, a sound that sent a ripple through the diner. Not a gasp, not a cry, but a quiet shift, an acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. The steel was cold against her skin, familiar in a way it shouldn't have been, echoing stories she'd seen, heard, lived through in whispers and warnings. Mitchell's grip was firm, his fingers pressing just enough to assert control without leaving a mark. He was careful, the way men like him always were, forceful in ways that couldn't be easily proven later. Danielle kept her breathing even, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on his. He wanted her to struggle, to give him a reason to escalate further. She wouldn't. Not with Mia in the back, listening, scared, knowing something was wrong even if she couldn't see it. The weight of the cuffs was heavy, but Danielle's resolve was heavier. She stood tall, unbowed, refusing to let him break her, refusing to let him win. The air in the diner hung heavy, thick with unspoken tension as Mitchell's voice sliced through it, dripping with a smug satisfaction that made Danielle's skin prickle. "Just like I told you," he said. His head cocked slightly, a mocking glint in his eyes as he tugged her arm, forcing her to take a reluctant step toward the door. "Every single time, it ends the same way. You people just can't seem to figure out how to behave, can you?" His words were a taunt meant to burrow under her skin, but Danielle refused to let them take root. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, letting his venom settle in her chest like smoldering embers, refusing to let them spark into flame. Her eyes met his, steady and unyielding, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I think we both know exactly what you are," she said, her tone calm but razor sharp, "and I think you're too scared to say it out loud." Mitchell's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, and that flicker was enough for Danielle to know she'd struck a nerve, enough to remind her that no matter how tightly his grip clamped around her arm, he wasn't the one holding the power. His jaw tightened, and he yanked her forward with more force than necessary, dragging her toward the diner's exit. The room around them was a gallery of silent witnesses' faces that refused to meet her gaze, eyes that dropped to plates of half-eaten food, pretending the scene unfolding before them was invisible. The diner owner stood behind the counter, his lips pressed into a thin line, his knuckles whitening around the rag he clutched. An older couple by the window shifted uncomfortably, the woman's hand hovering over her husband's wrist as if debating whether to act, to speak, to do anything at all. And then there was Lisa, stationed just outside the doorway to the back, where Mia had vanished moments earlier. Her posture was tense, her fingers resting lightly on the doorframe, her body angled as if ready to spring at the first sign of trouble. Danielle's eyes locked with hers for a fleeting moment, a silent exchange that carried a world of meaning. Mia was safe for now. The diner's door swung open, and the harsh morning light flooded in, cold and unforgiving, accompanied by the looming presence of a squad car parked at the curb. Mitchell pulled her past the sparse crowd outside a woman walking her dog who froze mid-step, a man at the newspaper stand who turned away as if he could unsee the moment. As they reached the car, Mitchell leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, venomous murmur, his breath hot against her ear. "You'll be out in a few hours," he said, his tone laced with false civility. "But don't worry, I'm sure your kind is used to cooling off in a cell." Danielle's fingers curled into her palms, nails biting into her skin, but her breathing remained steady, controlled. He wanted a reaction, a crack in her armor, but she refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she turned her head just enough to meet his gaze, a slow, deliberate smile curling at the corner of her lips. "Oh, don't you worry," she said, her voice smooth as velvet, laced with a quiet danger. "You'll be seeing me again real soon." For the briefest moment, something flickered in Mitchell's eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear, as if he sensed he'd misjudged her, but he smothered it quickly, shoving her into the backseat of the patrol car with a rough push. The door slammed shut, sealing her in a space that reeked of sweat, stale leather, and the weight of countless untold stories. The air inside was thick, oppressive, the silence stretching taut between Danielle and the partitions separating her from Mitchell. He slid into the driver's seat, his fingers drumming lazily against the steering wheel, as if this was just another morning, just another routine, just another black woman he'd cuffed for daring to stand her ground. Danielle sat perfectly still, her shoulders squared, her wrists throbbing where the cuffs bit into her skin. She could feel his expectation, his desire to see her crumble, to see fear or regret in her eyes. But she gave him nothing. Instead, she shifted slightly, testing the movement of her wrists, and let out a slow, measured breath. "You always this eager to waste taxpayer money?" "Officer," she asked, her voice steady, cutting through the silence like a whip. Mitchell smirked, not bothering to look back, his head tilting with that casual cruelty he wore so easily. "See, that's what I love about your kind," he said, his tone dripping with dismissal. "Always got something to say, always playing the victim the second things don't go your way. You run your mouth, you get what's coming. Simple as that." Danielle let out a soft hum, leaning her head against the headrest, her eyes tracing the blur of buildings as they drove through town. "Funny," she mused, her voice sharp and deliberate. "How people like you always talk about your kind, but never have the guts to say what you really mean. Guess that badge doesn't give you as much courage as you think." Mitchell's grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw twitching for a split second before he forced a sharp chuckle, shaking his head as he pulled into the police station lot. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" he muttered, throwing the car into park and glancing back at her, his smirk still in place but strained, like a mask starting to crack. "Doesn't matter. You'll have plenty of time to think about it and holding." Danielle met his gaze through the partition, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against him, heavy and uncomfortable. Then she smiled again, slow and steady, her voice a low murmur. "You really don't know what's coming, do you?" Mitchell's smirk faltered, but before he could respond, he shoved open his door and slammed it behind him, rounding the car to yank hers open. His grip closed around her arm again, firm and unnecessary, a reminder of his assumed control. Danielle let herself be pulled forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, the cuffs digging into her wrists with every step. But in her mind, she was already steps ahead, because she knew something he didn't. The world was about to shift beneath his feet. Inside the precinct, the air buzzed with the practiced rhythm of routine. Officers moved through the space with the ease of familiarity, their desks cluttered with paperwork, phones ringing in the background, conversations humming low. But a new energy had settled over the room, subtle but unmistakable. Chief Marcus Carter stood near the entrance to his new office, his tall, commanding frame dressed in a crisp, dark uniform, his badge catching the fluorescent light. His posture was relaxed but firm, his expression neutral yet piercing, taking in every detail of the room, the glances, the whispers, the cautious curiosity. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. Marcus had already met a few officers, their reactions ranging from polite to guarded, some tinged with unease. He'd expected it. He'd walked into precincts before where his arrival alone had been enough to unsettle the status quo, and this was no different. He was mid-conversation with Captain Reynolds, a seasoned officer with a weathered face and a gaze that held more curiosity than hostility, when the front doors swung open. Marcus turned instinctively, his attention sharpening, and then he saw her, Danielle, handcuffed, led by an officer who hadn't even noticed him yet. The world seemed to tilt, the moment crystallizing with a clarity that hit like a shockwave. Marcus froze, not out of hesitation but from the sheer weight of what he was witnessing. And then, before his mind fully caught up, his body was already moving. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the precinct like a blade. "What the hell is this?" Mitchell stopped dead, caught off guard by the sudden authority in the air. He turned, still smug, still brimming with misplaced confidence, until his eyes landed on Marcus, until they flicked to the nameplate on his uniform, until the realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. Chief Marcus Carter. Mitchell's mouth opened, words stumbling as he scrambled for an explanation, but Marcus's gaze was unrelenting, sharp enough to pin him in place. The precinct seemed to hold its breath, the air charged with the promise of something seismic, something that would change everything. In the heart of the precinct, where the hum of routine usually reigned, a storm was brewing. Mitchell, a young officer with a swagger that bordered on arrogance, stood frozen, his fingers gripping the cold steel handcuffs that bound Danielle's wrists. Shabada, Lemire, unshaken iron, her posture as composed as if she were attending a formal gala rather than standing in the middle of a police station. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes sharp and observant, taking in every flicker of emotion in the room. She exhaled slowly, deliberately, her breath a quiet anchor in the chaos unfolding around her. Then, with the same unshakable calm that had carried her through the morning's ordeal, she turned her gaze to her husband, Marcus, who stood like a statue carved from stone. Her voice, when she spoke, was smooth as silk but laced with a venomous satisfaction that cut through the air. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet the officer who arrested me this morning." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. His eyes, locked on Mitchell, narrowed just enough to send a shiver down the younger man's spine. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air growing heavy with an unspoken shift. Mitchell felt it the moment when everything he thought he knew unraveled. The precinct, usually alive with the clatter of keyboards and the murmur of officers, fell silent, as if the walls themselves were waiting for what came next. Marcus exhaled, a low, controlled sound that carried the weight of a predator sizing up its prey. In that instant, Mitchell knew he was finished. The tension in the room was palpable, like the crackle of electricity before a thunderstorm. Mitchell's fingers tightened around the cuffs, his knuckles whitening as his mind raced to catch up with the reality crashing down around him. He stood caught between instinct and dread, between the arrogance he'd worn like a badge just moments ago and the dawning realization of his mistake. Marcus hadn't moved, his presence dominating the space without effort. His silence was more oppressive than any shout, more suffocating than any accusation. Mitchell's lips parted, his voice trembling as he tried to claw back some semblance of control. "Chief," he began, his tone unsteady, a stark contrast to the bravado he'd carried earlier. Marcus didn't react. His gaze flickered briefly to the cuffs on his wife's wrists, and that single glance was enough to make Mitchell's stomach drop. Danielle stood poised, her chin lifted, her expression a mask of unreadable calm, but her silence spoke louder than words. She could feel the bite of the metal against her skin, the way Mitchell's grip had tightened when the truth hit him, the way the entire room had frozen when Marcus's voice first cut through the air. And then Marcus spoke again, his voice low, deliberate, and heavy with authority. "Take the cuffs off." The words weren't loud. They weren't shouted or snarled, but they landed like a gavel, an undeniable command that reverberated through the precinct. Mitchell didn't move at first, not out of defiance, but because his body hadn't caught up with his brain. Danielle saw it before anyone else, the twitch of his fingers, the clench of his jaw, the hitch in his breath as he grappled with the reality of his situation. "Sir," he tried again, his voice desperate now, grasping for the authority that was slipping through his fingers like sand. She was causing a disturbance. Marcus took a single step forward, and the room seemed to shrink. Mitchell's words died in his throat. The space between them was razor thin now, but Marcus didn't need to close the distance to make his presence felt. He was everywhere in the heavy silence, in the uneasy glances of the other officers, in the way Mitchell's career was unraveling with every passing second. Marcus tilted his head, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Take the cuffs off." Mitchell swallowed hard, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before he fumbled for the key. The click of the cuffs unlocking echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Danielle felt the release, the sudden absence of pressure. But she didn't move. Not yet. Mitchell stepped back, his posture rigid, his breath uneven, his hands lingering near his belt as if he could still find his authority somewhere in the weight of his uniform. Marcus exhaled slowly, a breath laced with restrained fury. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting his wife's. "Are you okay?" Danielle flexed her wrists, the faint sting of the cuffs lingering like a ghost. She brushed her hands lightly, then nodded once, her voice steady. "I'm fine." Mitchell let out a quiet scoff, barely audible but enough to draw Marcus's attention. His gaze snapped back to the officer so quickly that Mitchell flinched, his body tensing as if bracing for impact. "Something funny?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously low, the kind of quiet that made every other officer in the room take an instinctive step back. Mitchell hesitated, his fingers curling into a subtle fist. He was unraveling now, his confidence crumbling under the weight of Marcus's stare. "Sir," he tried again, his voice edged with defiance, with desperation, with resentment. "I was just doing my job." Marcus's brow lifted slightly, his expression darkening. "Your job." The words were a challenge, a blade slicing through Mitchell's flimsy defense. The officer straightened, trying to reclaim what little ground he had left. "Yes, sir." She was being uncooperative. She was disturbing the peace. She was sitting in a diner with her child. Marcus's voice cut through the excuse like a knife, sharp and unyielding. Mitchell stiffened, his face paling as Marcus took another step forward, close enough now that there was no room for misinterpretation. "Tell me," Marcus continued, his voice calm but heavy with an undeniable weight. "At what point did sitting at a table become a crime? At what point did eating breakfast with your daughter require police intervention? At what point did you decide that your badge gave you the right to target someone for nothing more than existing in a space you didn't think they belonged in?" Mitchell had no answer. There was no answer. The truth hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Marcus's jaw tensed, his patience wearing thin, but his voice remained steady, like a storm held at bay. He took another step, so close now that Mitchell had no choice but to meet his eyes. "Let me make something very clear to you." "Officer?" Marcus said, his voice like steel, like thunder rolling in the distance, like the moment before a landslide. "I don't care how things were done before I got here. I don't care what you thought you could get away with. I don't care how much you think that uniform protects you. What I care about is this." His voice dropped lower, sharper, each word a nail in Mitchell's coffin. "You are a disgrace to this badge. You are an embarrassment to this department. And as of right now, you are under investigation for misconduct." Mitchell's entire body locked up, his breath caught, his mouth opening as if to argue, to push back, to fight them, but there was nothing left to fight for. The room had already judged him. The other officers, who had been silent spectators, were no longer neutral. Some looked relieved, as if a weight had been lifted. Others looked cautious, their eyes darting between Marcus and Mitchell. A few regarded Mitchell with a cold detachment, as if he were already a stranger. No one was going to stand beside him now. The balance of power had shifted, and Mitchell was no longer the one in control. Marcus took a slow step back, straightening, exhaling as if releasing the last thread of restraint he'd been holding onto. Without breaking eye contact, he lifted a hand and gestured to two officers nearby. "Take his badge," he said, his voice absolute. Mitchell's breath hitched, his eyes widening in disbelief. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "And take him out of my sight." The precinct remained frozen in the aftermath, the weight of Marcus's authority settling over the room like a slow-moving storm. Mitchell stood rigid, his fists clenched, his chest heaving with shallow, clippant breaths. His face was a mask of defiance and disbelief, his mind clearly rejecting the reality unfolding before him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the officer. She was the problem. This wasn't discipline, it was betrayal. His jaw clenched as his gaze flickered around the room, searching for an ally, for anything to hold on to. Marcus's voice cut through the silence again, measured and final. "Take his badge." The order landed like a hammer, and Mitchell felt it in his chest. One of the officers, a man named Travis who had worked alongside Mitchell for years, stepped forward. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes were firm, unyielding. "Mitchell," he muttered, his voice low and warning. Mitchell's eyes snapped to him, his nostrils flaring. "Are you serious?" His voice was sharp, incredulous, teetering on the edge of panic. "You're really going to do this?" Travis didn't answer. He didn't need to. The moment stretched. Mitchell's body thrumming with barely contained rage. His fingers flexed, his muscles coiling as if he might push back, as if he could still fight his way out of this. Marcus took another step forward, his voice colder now, sharper. "You have 10 seconds. The words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Mitchell's world collapsed in that moment, and the precinct watched as the storm broke over him, leaving nothing but the wreckage of his own making. In the tense stillness of the precinct, Officer Travis Mitchell stood, his breath shallow and ragged, his entire body quaking with a fury so raw it seemed to pulse through the air around him. His hands trembled, fingers twitching over the crisp fabric of his uniform, lingering near the badge pinned to his chest. It wasn't hesitation that held him there, not doubt or second thoughts, but a seething, unfiltered resentment that burned hotter with every passing second. Then, with a sudden, jagged motion, he tore the badge free, his movements sharp and forceful, his face contorting as though the act itself was a personal affront to his very existence. For a fleeting moment, he clutched it, staring down at the gleaming metal as if it still belonged to him, as if this whole scene were some cruel mistake that could be undone. But the rage took over again, and with a surge of venom, he thrust the badge into the waiting hand of the officer standing before him. The moment it left his grip, something fractured inside him, not regret, not fear, but a deeper, more dangerous kind of anger. His chest heaved, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened, and his jaw locked with such force it seemed his teeth might crack under the strain. A sharp, bitter huff escaped him. His entire frame coiled like a spring wound too tight, carrying the unbearable weight of a man who never once imagined he'd find himself in this position. "This," he spat, his voice slicing through the room like a blade, thick with venom and defiance. is what I get for doing my damn job. Across the room, Marcus, the chief, stood unmoving, his expression unreadable. A few feet away, Danielle shifted slightly, the ache in her wrist from the handcuffs finally easing. She tilted her head, studying Mitchell as he unraveled before her, his composure crumbling under the weight of his own indignation. "Your job," she echoed, her voice slow and deliberate, laced with a cold, cutting edge. "So tell me, Officer Mitchell, what exactly was your job supposed to be today? Was it insulting a mother in front of her child, or escalating a situation just because I wouldn't let you walk all over me?" She paused, letting her words settle, letting the silence stretch taut before delivering the final blow. "Or was your job just to make sure everyone in that diner knew who you thought was in charge?" Mitchell's eyes flashed with something dark and ugly, his lips curling into a sneer. "I don't have to justify myself to you," he growled, his voice low and simmering with contempt. "You have no idea what it's like dealing with people like you day after day, the attitudes, the disrespect, the constant pushing, like we're the villains just for doing our dues." Danielle let out a sharp, humorless laugh, her gaze unflinching. "You really don't get it, do you?" She took a slow step forward, her presence steady, unshaken, fearless. "You think I was the problem because I didn't make it already easy for you, because I didn't bow my head and let you talk down to me like I was nothing, because I made you explain yourself." Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened, each word landing with the weight of undeniable truth. "And now look at you," she continued, her eyes locked on his, her tone dripping with quiet finality. "Stripped of your badge, being marched out of your own station, and you still don't think you did anything wrong." Mitchell's jaw twitched, and a short, bitter laugh escaped him. "I didn't," he snapped, his voice hard and unyielding. "This isn't justice. This is a goddamn witch hunt." His eyes darted to Marcus, burning with resentment. "You can play the hero all you want, Chief, but we both know what's really going on here." He took a step forward, his lip curling. "You're making an example out of me. That's all this is. It's not about justice, it's about power. Your power, not mine." Marcus met his gaze, his face still unreadable, his breathing steady, his presence like a wall that wouldn't budge. Then, slowly, he exhaled, and a smile spread across his face, not smug, not triumphant, but something far worse, the quiet, unshakable smile of a man who knew he'd already won. "You finally get it," Marcus said, his voice low and lethal. "This is about power." He let the words hang in the air, let them sink into Mitchell's bones, let him choke on their weight before delivering the final strike. "And you don't have any anymore." Mitchell's face darkened, his hands twitching at his sides, his body still fighting against the reality closing in around him. Two officers stepped forward, one placing a firm hand on his arm. "Time to go," the officer muttered. Mitchell jerked his arm free, not out of acceptance but out of sheer defiance, as if he still believed this wasn't the end, as if he could somehow still come out on top. Danielle watched him go, her eyes never leaving him, her stance unshakable. He didn't look back, he couldn't, and as the precinct doors swung shut behind him, she knew that whatever fight he had left didn't matter anymore. This was only the beginning of the reckoning. The town didn't stay quiet for long. The moment Officer Prior Travis Mitchell was escorted out of the precinct, the news spread like wildfire, splintering through the community and leaving cracks that no one could ignore. By evening, the story was everywhere. The chief of police had placed a decorated officer under investigation for misconduct. Some saw it as justice long overdue, others saw it as a betrayal of the badge. For Mitchell, it was something else entirely, an opportunity. He wasn't going to fade into obscurity, wasn't going to let his name be added to the list of officers sacrificed to what he saw as a political agenda. He was going to fight. By morning, the story dominated every news outlet. Local papers splashed the headline across their websites. Radio hosts dissected every detail, and social media erupted with debates that burned hotter than the facts could contain. Two camps emerged. One side saw the truth, the footage from the diner, the accounts of patrons stepping forward, the weight of a system that had shielded men like Mitchell for too long, finally cracking under pressure. But the other side refused to accept it. This is political. A retired officer grumbled on a local morning show, his voice heavy with the bitterness of someone who couldn't see the flaws in the system he'd spent his life defending. Chief Carter came in with an agenda. This isn't about justice, it's about power. The same words Mitchell had spat in the precinct, the same justification, the same refusal to face reality. By midday, protesters had gathered. Some stood outside City Hall, holding signs demanding accountability, calling for a full investigation into how many officers had been allowed to act with impunity. Others rallied outside the police department, not in support of justice, but in defense of Mitchell. Their signs reading "Back the Blue," their voices fueled by anger and a refusal to believe that the badge could ever be wrong. In the midst of the chaos, Mitchell stepped into the spotlight. Standing before a podium outside his lawyer's office, flanked by a man known for defending officers in cases just like this, he faced a sea of cameras and microphones. The anger still simmered beneath his carefully crafted mask of defiance, but his voice was steady, resolute, dripping with conviction. "I never thought I'd see the day when doing your job meant losing everything," he said, his words ringing out with a practiced sincerity that masked the resentment beneath. "But that's exactly what happened to me." He paused, letting the crowd absorb his words, letting the cameras capture the moment. "I've dedicated my career to protecting this town. I've upheld the law, put my life on the line, and what do I get in return? I get thrown under the bus to satisfy a political stunt." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others watching with cautious skepticism. Then he dropped the bombshell. "That's why I'm suing the department," he announced, his voice clear and bold. "And I'm suing Chief Carter personally for defamation, wrongful termination, and abuse of power." The press erupted, questions flying, cameras flashing, the air thick with outrage and anticipation. Back at the precinct, Marcus heard the news before he saw it. Notifications flooded his phone as he sat in his office, reviewing the details of the internal investigation. By the time he stepped into the break room, half the precinct was gathered around the TV, watching Mitchell's face fill the screen. Marcus didn't react, didn't speak, didn't show even a flicker of surprise. He knew men like Mitchell. They never admitted fault, never backed down. Not because they were right, but because they couldn't bear the thought of losing. The lawsuit landed like a spark in a powder keg, igniting a battle that would unfold not in the streets, but in courtrooms and press conferences. That afternoon, Marcus sat across from his legal team, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. "He doesn't have a case," one of the lawyers muttered, flipping through the complaint. "But that doesn't matter. He's not trying to win in court." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. Mitchell wasn't fighting for justice. He was fighting for relevance, for vindication, for the power he'd lost. And in a town already divided, that fight was only just beginning. Marcus sat at the conference table, his fingers interlocked in a steeple, his breathing deliberate and calm. He was a man who carried the weight of conviction with a quiet intensity. "He's banking on swaying public opinion," Marcus said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "He thinks if he blows this up enough, drags it out long enough, the department will buckle just to make it go away. He's counting on a settlement." His words hung in the air, heavy with certainty. "They won't," he added, his tone unyielding, like a man who'd already seen the end of this fight and knew the outcome. Danielle, seated beside him, folded her arms tightly across her chest, her face etched with a smoldering anger she barely kept in check. "He still thinks he's the victim," she muttered, her voice low, laced with disbelief. She shook her head, her dark curls swaying slightly. "After everything, the footage, the witnesses, the way the entire town saw him for what he is, he still believes he's in the right." Marcus exhaled slowly, his fingertips pressing into the polished wood of the table. "Because in his mind, he is," he said softly. his words carrying the weight of grim understanding. The room fell into a heavy silence. Danielle's lips parted, her sharp gaze locking onto Marcus, her breath catching as the truth settled over her. She knew he was right. Mitchell, the disgraced officer, didn't see himself as the villain. In his warped view, he was the one wronged, a casualty of a system that had always had his back until it didn't. And now, facing the consequences of his actions, he was doing what men like him always did, digging in deeper, refusing to yield. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his resolve a quiet, unshakable force. "We're not just fighting him," he said, his voice measured but firm. "We're fighting everyone who thinks like him." Danielle let out a slow, controlled breath, her eyes meeting his. She nodded, a single, resolute motion. "Then we make sure we win." And night had draped itself over the city, casting long, heavy shadows that seemed to hush the streets below. But the quiet outside was deceptive, a fragile veneer over the storm raging beyond the walls of the Carter household. The world was abuzz with noise news channels dissecting Mitchell's lawsuit with relentless fervor. Social media platforms drowning in heated arguments. Radio hosts spinning the case into yet another skirmish in the endless war of narratives. Inside the Carter home, though, the air was still not peaceful, but thick with an uneasy calm. Danielle stood in the kitchen, her fingers resting lightly on the cool granite countertop. Her body was motionless, but her mind churned. Far from the soft glow of the overhead light, the day had been grueling, the kind that stretched, every nerve taut, where exhaustion seeped into the marrow, settling into the quiet spaces between thoughts. It wasn't just tiredness, it was the kind of bone-deep weariness that made rest feel like a distant promise. The faint sound of footsteps broke her reverie, small, tentative steps. The soft patter of bare feet against the hardwood floor. Danielle turned, already knowing who she'd see. Mia, her 8-year-old daughter, stood in the doorway, her wide eyes gleaming with questions too heavy for a child her age. "Hey, baby," Danielle said, her voice softer than she'd expected, the exhaustion smoothed out as she knelt to meet Mia's gaze. "Can't sleep." Mia shook her head, her small fingers twisting nervously into the hem of her oversized sleep shirt. "Too much noise," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Danielle's heart clenched. She knew Mia wasn't talking about the house. The noise was the world outside, the clamor of opinions, the anger, the relentless churn of a story that had consumed their lives. Mia hesitated, her brows knitting together as she struggled to find the words. "Are they mad at Daddy?" she finally asked, her voice small but piercing. Danielle drew in a deep breath, forcing herself to hold her daughter's gaze, to face the question head on. She reached out, brushing a gentle hand over Mia's hair, grounding herself in the moment. "Some people are," she admitted, her voice steady but honest. "Some people don't like that Daddy made sure the right thing happened." Mia's lips pressed into a tight line, her young mind grappling with the weight of the words. "But he's the boss," she said, her tone tinged with confusion. "Why are they mad at him for stopping the bad guy?" Danielle let out a slow breath, feeling the question settle like a stone in her chest. She wanted to shield Mia, to tell her the world was simple, that good always triumphed, that justice was clear-cut. But Mia was 8, and the world was already teaching her otherwise. "It's not always easy to make people see what's right," Danielle said carefully, weaving truth with reassurance. "Some people don't want to see it. Some get angry when they have to face what they've done wrong. And when someone like Daddy holds them accountable, they push back." Mia frowned, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, like a child trying to puzzle out a problem too big for her, like when you tell someone to say sorry, but they don't want to. A small, bittersweet laugh escaped Danielle's lips. "Kinda like that," she said, her voice gentle. "Except instead of saying sorry, they're trying to act like they didn't do anything wrong at all." Mia's frown deepened, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. "That's not fair," she said, her voice small but firm. "No," Danielle agreed, her tone soft but resolute. "It's not." Mia stared at the floor, her small hands still clutching her shirt, her mind turning over the unfairness of it all. Then she looked up, her voice quieter now, trembling with a child's uncertainty. Is Daddy going to be okay? Danielle's chest ached at the question, at the way Mia's voice carried a worry no child should bear. She smoothed a hand over Mia's cheek, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a low, unwavering promise. Daddy is the strongest person I know, she said, her words infused with quiet certainty. And he's not alone. We're in this together, all of us. No matter what happens, we'll be okay. Mia studied her mother's face, searching for any hint of doubt, any crack in the assurance. But Danielle's expression was a fortress, solid and unyielding. Slowly, the tension in Mia's small frame eased, not entirely, but enough. She gave a thoughtful nod, then stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Danielle's neck. Danielle's throat tightened as she held her daughter close, feeling the fragile warmth of her, the quiet strength of a child navigating a world that didn't play fair. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in the quiet of the kitchen, surrounded by shadows and worry, but anchored by love, always love. Then a familiar voice broke the silence from the doorway. You two having a meeting without me. Danielle looked up to see Marcus stepping into the kitchen, his presence like a steady tide washing over the room. He was still in his uniform, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, but his eyes softened the moment they landed on his wife and daughter. Mia turned instantly, breaking away from Danielle to rush toward her father, her small arms wrapping around his waist before he could even kneel. Marcus let out a quiet breath, leaning down to press a kiss to the top of her head. You okay, baby girl, he murmured, his voice warm and grounding. Mia nodded, her voice muffled against his shirt. I just wanted to make sure you were... Marcus's jaw tightened, a flicker of emotion crossing his face before he smoothed it away. He held her a little tighter, just for a moment, then pulled back, crouching to meet her eyes. I'm good, he promised, his voice steady. But you know who's even better. Mia tilted her head, curious. Who? He smiled, small but genuine, the kind of smile that could light up a room even on the darkest day. You. Mia's face brightened, her lips curling into a shy, real smile. Danielle watched them, a warmth blooming in her chest despite the chaos swirling around them. Marcus straightened, his hand resting lightly on Mia's shoulder as he met Danielle's gaze over her head. It was a silent exchange, a question, a reassurance, a shared resolve. She nodded, just enough to answer. Mia yawned, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand, and Danielle took the cue. Come on, baby, she said, pressing a gentle hand to Mia's back. Time for bed. Mia didn't protest. Following her mother down the hall, she glanced back once, her eyes finding Marcus. He offered her a small wink, and Mia's lips curved into a faint smile before she disappeared into her room. When Danielle returned, Marcus was still in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his expression heavier now that Mia was gone. The weight of the day of the fight settled over him like a shadow. Danielle stepped toward him, her arms crossing loosely. It's getting ugly, she said, her voice low. Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. It's going to get worse. She nodded, unsurprised, her resolve mirroring his. Then we fight. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers, and for a moment he let the exhaustion show the toll of carrying not just his own burden, but the weight of everyone who believed in him. Danielle saw it, felt it. She stepped closer, resting a hand against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. He exhaled, leaning into her touch, just for a second, before his voice came, low and unwavering. We fight. Besettia. The morning after Mitchell's lawsuit hit the media, the storm broke wide open. It had been one thing when the town buzzed with debates over what had happened at the diner, arguments flaring in barbershops, coffee shops, and online comment sections, where strangers lobbed words like grenades. But the moment Mitchell stepped in front of the cameras, casting himself as the face of a so-called injustice, the narrative shifted. He wasn't just a disgraced officer anymore. He was a symbol, a rallying cry for those who saw his downfall as an attack on their own beliefs. The city braced itself as the battle lines were drawn, and the Carters Marcus, Danielle, and even little Mia stood at the heart of it, ready to fight not just for justice, but for the truth that Mitchell and those like him would rather bury. In a small town where loyalties ran deep and tensions simmered beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, and at its heart stood a cop named Mitchell, a man who had once worn his badge like a crown but now clung to it like a lifeline. This wasn't just a story about one officer's fall from grace. It was about power, control, and the dangerous dance between those who saw themselves in Mitchell's defiance and those who saw through it. Caught in the crossfire were Marcus and Danielle, two figures determined to hold the line against a tide of distortion and denial. The press conference was a carefully orchestrated spectacle, designed to cast Mitchell as a martyr in a war he claimed was waged against him. A crowd of supporters stood behind a podium, angled just right to frame him as a hero. An American flag draped strategically in the background to stir patriotic fervor. Mitchell, dressed not in his uniform, but in a dark suit, his tie loosened to suggest approachability, gripped the podium like a soldier bracing for battle. His lawyer, a heavyweight in conservative legal circles known for turning accused officers into symbols of a besieged system, stood by his side, exuding confidence. Mitchell's voice, steady and rehearsed, cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "I've given my life to this town," he declared, his tone heavy with the weight of sacrifice. "Every day, I put on that badge knowing the risks, knowing what it pays, because that's what a good officer does. And now because of a political witch hunt, I've been cast aside like I was never one of them." The cameras flashed, capturing the moment as the small but vocal crowd nodded, their murmurs of agreement rippling through the parking lot turned stage. "This isn't about justice," Mitchell continued, his voice rising with calculated passion. "This is about power. Chief Carter wanted to send a message, and he used me to do it. He took my career, my reputation, my future, all to push his agenda." The crowd erupted in familiar chants, phrases that always surfaced when accountability knocked at the door. Mitchell seized the moment, promising, "This is just the beginning. We're going to fight, and we're going to win." Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust toward him, headlines already taking shape before the last word left his mouth. In a dimly lit office across town, Marcus watched the live feed flicker across his television screen, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. But his eyes weren't fixed on Mitchell, they were on the people behind him, the supporters clutching signs, nodding along, not for Mitchell himself, but for the idea he embodied. "This isn't about him anymore," Marcus said, his voice low, his jaw clenched as he stood rigid before the screen. Danielle, seated at the desk, leaned back, her fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the polished wood. "It never was," she replied, her gaze sharp, dissecting the footage like a strategist studying a battlefield. Marcus exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if to shake off the weight pressing down on him. "He's going to drag this out." Danielle continued, her voice steady but laced with certainty. "He knows he can't win in court, but that's not the goal. He's playing for time. The longer this drags on, the more he can convince people he's the victim." Marcus let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "The longer this lasts, the more it'll feel like a debate instead of cold, hard facts." Danielle nodded, her eyes still on the screen. That's exactly what he wants. For a moment, silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Marcus turned away from the TV, rubbing a hand over his face before leaning against the desk. "This should be open and shut," he muttered, frustration etching lines into his face. Body cam footage, witnesses, his history of complaints. It's all there. If he wasn't a cop, he wouldn't have a leg to stand on. Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze unwavering. If he wasn't a cop, he wouldn't have made it this far. Marcus nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. Danielle studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly against the desk. "You're ready for this, right?" she asked, her voice even but carrying an undercurrent of concern. He met her gaze, his eyes steady but shadowed. "I don't have a choice." "That's not what I asked," she pressed, tilting her head slightly, waiting. Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging just a fraction. "No," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Raw. I'm not." Danielle waited, giving him space to unpack the weight of what lay ahead. Marcus ran a hand over his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he grappled with the reality of their fight. "I knew this wouldn't be easy," he said, his voice low, measured. "I knew stepping into the chief's role meant pushing against people who'd fight change tooth and nail. But this isn't just about Mitchell. It's about everyone like him, everyone who thinks accountability is an attack, who sees justice as a personal betrayal." Danielle leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her voice quiet but resolute. "You knew this was coming the moment you told him to turn in his badge." Marcus let out a slow breath, the memory of that moment flashing in his mind. "Yeah," he muttered. "I just didn't expect it to hit this hard, this fast." Danielle's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more an acknowledgement of their shared reality. They always move fast when they feel cornered. Marcus let her words settle, then straightened, rolling his shoulders back as if bracing for the fight ahead. "Then we move faster," he said, his voice steadier now, laced with a quiet determination. Danielle nodded, a spark of approval in her eyes. The battle was only beginning. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the air thick with the kind of silence that hums with unspoken stakes. It wasn't just about one man's fate, it was about a struggle for control, for the power to shape truth into something malleable, something that could bend under the right pressure. Mitchell sat at the defendant's table, his posture rigid, his suit crisp but his tie knotted too tightly, betraying the strain he tried to hide. His fingers tapped restlessly against the table, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting as if his own skin felt like a cage. His lawyer, a seasoned defender of officers accused of crossing lines, flipped through notes with the calm of someone who'd twisted worse cases into victories with the right spin. But Mitchell wasn't calm. Marcus, seated across the room with his legal team and Danielle, could see the anger simmering beneath the surface, the way Mitchell's leg bounced under the table, the way his fists clenched and unclenched, as if he were fighting to convince himself he was still in the game. Maybe, for a fleeting moment, Mitchell had believed this courtroom would be his redemption, a stage where he could paint himself as the victim of an overzealous administration. But the room wasn't his to command, and deep down, he knew it. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a career built on cutting through theatrics, looked up from her notes. "Mr. Mitchell, please take the stand." Mitchell rose, his movements sharp, deliberate, each step toward the witness stand a quiet act of defiance. His lawyer had coached him stay calm, keep answers measured, let indignation show but never boil over. But Marcus knew men like Mitchell, knew self-control wasn't their strength. Mitchell took his oath, sat, adjusted his tie, and braced himself to perform. His lawyer stepped forward, his voice smooth and practiced. "Officer Mitchell, in your own words, tell us what happened the day of your termination." Mitchell exhaled, the sound laced with bitterness. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice tight but controlled, carrying through the courtroom. "That morning, I walked into the diner like I always do. I saw someone causing a disturbance." Marcus didn't flinch, didn't move. Danielle, beside him, was equally still, her eyes locked on Mitchell. He paused, as if waiting for the jury to lean in, to feel his grievance. His lawyer nodded. "And this individual," "A woman," Mitchell corrected, his tone sour, edged with resentment. "She was making a scene. I tried to de-escalate, but she got aggressive." The words landed like stones, deliberate and heavy. Marcus's fingers tightened against his knee, but his face remained a mask. Mitchell was lying not outright, but in the way that reshaped reality just enough to shift blame. His lawyer pressed, "When you say aggressive, what do you mean?" Mitchell turned slightly, addressing the jury as much as the lawyer. She was disrespectful, he said, his voice hardening. She ignored direct orders from an officer. She was combative, belligerent. She escalated the situation, and I had no choice but to arrest her. There it was, his version of the story, his justification, his bid to rewrite history. Danielle's body tensed beside Marcus, though her expression didn't shift. Mitchell's lawyer stepped back, nodding as if his client had unveiled some profound truth. No further questions. The judge's gaze shifted. Prosecution. Ellen Vasquez, their lawyer, rose, a sharp, unflinching woman who'd seen too many cases like this to be swayed by theatrics. Marcus exhaled slowly, knowing the real fight was about to begin. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy, every seat filled, every eye trained on the woman who stood poised at the center of it all. Ellen Vasquez rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she were savoring the weight of the moment. She had been waiting for this, preparing for it. Her notes clutched in one hand, her gaze sharp and unyielding. She took a single, measured step forward, flipping through her pages with a practiced ease before locking eyes with the man in the witness stand, Officer Mitchell. Officer Mitchell, she began, her voice smooth but edged with a precision that cut through the room like a blade. I'd like to revisit something you said earlier. You described Ms. Carter as combative. Is that correct? Mitchell, rigid in his uniform, gave a curt nod, his jaw tight. Yes. Ellen's head tilted slightly, her expression neutral, but her eyes piercing. Did she physically threaten you? The silence that followed was heavy, stretching just a moment too long. Mitchell shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering. No, he admitted, the words slipping out reluctantly. But she was escalating. You said. Ellen's tone remained even, but there was a challenge woven into it. Could you clarify what you mean by escalating? Mitchell straightened, his shoulders squaring as he leaned into his defense. She was talking back, raising her voice. Ellen's brow lifted, just enough to signal her curiosity. Raising her voice, is that against the law, officer? Mitchell hesitated again, his eyes flickering to the side. It's disorderly conduct, he said, his voice firm but less certain than before. Disorderly conduct, Ellen repeated, nodding as if considering the phrase. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. You've been an officer for how long? 15 years. Correct? 15, Shara Mitchell replied, his tone carrying the weight of his experience, as if his years alone were enough to validate his actions. In those 15 years, Ellen continued, her voice sharpening, how many times have you arrested someone for disorderly conduct based solely on raising their voice? The room went still. Mitchell's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching against the armrest. The question lingered, unanswered, its implications sinking into the silence. Before he could respond, Ellen flipped a page in her file, her movements deliberate. Or, she said, her voice now a razor's edge, is it only disorderly when a black woman refuses to back down? A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Mitchell's face contorted, a mix of anger and defensiveness. That's not what happened, he snapped, his voice tight, barely restrained. Ellen's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Then let's talk about what did happen. She turned, pressing a button on the remote in her hand. The courtroom screen flickered to life, and the body camera footage began to play. Mitchell's face drained of color. The footage was unforgiving, his words, his tone, the smirk that curled his lips as he spoke, the insults, the dismissals, the subtle but unmistakable power play. And then, the moment that made the room go cold, no father around, no real discipline, no wonder the kid's already a problem. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mitchell's fingers twitched, his composure unraveling. Ellen turned to face him, her expression unreadable, but her victory unmistakable. No further questions, she said, her voice calm but resounding with finality. The air in the courtroom was thick, every breath measured, every movement deliberate. Mitchell sat frozen, his fists clenched on the table, his face a mask of barely contained fury. For weeks, He had cast himself as the victim, convincing himself that this trial was not about justice but a personal attack. Yet now his own words echoed in the room, his intentions exposed, his justifications crumbling under the weight of the evidence. Still, a part of him clung to the belief that he could walk away unscathed. Across the room, Danielle Carter sat composed, her posture steady, her expression serene in a way that seemed to defy the chaos Mitchell had tried to unleash. She wasn't here for revenge or even satisfaction. She was here for truth. When the judge called her name, she rose, smoothing her blazer with a quiet grace. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, the only sound in the hushed room as she made her way to the witness stand. Each step was purposeful, unhurried, a testament to her unshakable resolve. She raised her right hand, took the oath, and settled into the seat, her gaze calm but unwavering. Ellen stepped forward, her presence commanding yet measured. "Ms. Carter," she began, flipping open her notes, though it was clear she knew every detail by heart. "I'd like you to take us back to the morning of your arrest. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened?" Danielle exhaled slowly, her eyes meeting Ellen's before shifting slightly to the jury. "My daughter and I were having breakfast," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, each word chosen with care. "It was our usual routine." She was excited, telling me about her father's promotion at work. I was thinking about how to explain to her what leadership means, what it means to carry a responsibility, to do what's right even when it's hard. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. And then Officer Mitchell walked in. Her tone remained steady, her eyes never straying to the man in question. Ellen nodded. "What happened next?" Danielle folded her hands in her lap, her posture relaxed but her words carrying a quiet intensity. "He looked at me," she said, and I could tell he'd already made up his mind about me. "It's a look I've seen before. You don't need words to feel that kind of judgment. It's there in the way someone carries themselves, the way they decide who you are before they even know your name." She took a breath, her voice unwavering. "My daughter accidentally bumped into him. She's 8 years old. It was an accident. Nothing more. But instead of letting it go, instead of speaking to her like a person would speak to a child, he made a comment." Ellen tilted her head, her voice gentle but probing. "What did he say?" Danielle's jaw tightened, but her response was immediate. He said, "I should have known better than to walk past a table like this." The words hung in the air, their unspoken meaning clear to everyone in the room. A slow burn of tension spread through the audience. Ellen took a step forward. "And how did that make you feel?" Danielle met her gaze, her voice steady but resonant, like I wasn't a person to him. The simplicity of her answer landed like a blow. Ellen let it linger, giving the jury time to absorb its weight. "What happened after that?" she asked. Danielle inhaled, her fingers curling slightly against the wooden stand. "I told him my daughter was a child. I said it was an accident, that there was no reason to speak to her that way." Her voice didn't waver, but there was a fire beneath it now, a strength that reverberated through the room. That's when he started pushing, making comments, letting me know exactly what he thought of me, of my daughter, of who he assumed we were before he even asked our names. Mitchell shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable, his face a mask of tension. Danielle didn't glance his way. Ellen nodded, her voice steady. "And when you didn't back down?" Danielle's eyes were unflinching. "He escalated." Ellen stepped closer. "He arrested you?" "Yes," Danielle said with a single nod. "Had you committed a crime?" "No." "Were you threatening him?" "No." "Were you violent?" "No." Ellen turned to the jury, letting those answers sink in, each one a brick in the foundation of truth. Then she faced Danielle again, her voice softer but no less commanding. "Ms. Carter, I need you to answer this as honestly as you can. Why do you think Officer Mitchell arrested you that day?" Danielle's gaze shifted to the jury, her eyes locking onto theirs with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Because I didn't let him dehumanize me," she said, each word ringing with unshakable conviction. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Marcus, seated in the gallery, felt the air leave his lungs. That was it, the truth at the heart of everything. Mitchell hadn't arrested her because she was a threat or because she was disorderly. He had arrested her because she refused to let him strip her of her dignity. Ellen let the silence stretch, her eyes scanning the jury as Danielle's words settled into their minds. Then, with a nod, she said, "No further questions." The judge's gaze shifted to the defense cross-examination. Mitchell's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie with a forced air of confidence. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice smooth but tinged with desperation, "would you say you were angry that morning?" Danielle tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "Wouldn't you be, would be?" A few quiet chuckles broke the tension in the gallery, quickly silenced. The lawyer forced a thin smile, "But your voice was raised, wasn't it?" Danielle shrugged, unruffled. "I was standing up for my daughter." "So you admit you escalated the situation?" "No," she said simply, "I just didn't let him get away with what he wanted." The lawyer faltered, his confidence crumbling. He flipped through his notes, searching for something, anything to regain control, but there was nothing left. Danielle's truth was unshakable, etched into the very walls of the courtroom. "No further questions," he muttered, defeated. Danielle rose, her movements graceful, and walked back to her seat without so much as a glance in Mitchell's direction. To her, he was already irrelevant. The jury had been deliberating for 3 hours, and the courtroom was a pressure cooker of anticipation. Every second stretched, heavy with the weight of what was at stake. Conversations had dwindled to whispers, then faded entirely, leaving only the thick silence. Marcus sat motionless, his face unreadable. But Danielle could sense the storm beneath his calm, the way his fingers rested against his knee, still as stone, the way his breathing stayed slow and deliberate, anchoring him against the uncertainty. Patience had never been his strength, not when it came to injustice, not when it came to waiting for a system that so often failed to deliver. Danielle, by contrast, was a portrait of calm. She smoothed her hands over her lap, her mind quiet but her body still carrying the memory of that morning, the cold bite of the cuffs, the diner's fluorescent lights, the moment Mitchell thought he could break her. But she hadn't broken. She had stood firm. And now, as the jury deliberated, she carried that same quiet strength, waiting not for vengeance but for the truth to be acknowledged. The door to the jury room opened, and the room collectively held its breath. The truth was coming, and nothing could stop it now. The courtroom doors swung open with a heavy creak, and Marcus's best friend stepped forward, his presence commanding a hush that rippled through the room. The jury had reached a verdict. A restless energy surged through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, their whispers fading into a taut silence. The air grew thick with anticipation as the jurors filed in, their faces a carefully guarded mask of neutrality, eyes fixed straight ahead, betraying nothing. Across the room, Mitchell sat rigid, his posture stiffening as his lawyer murmured something in his ear. He barely acknowledged it. For the past 3 hours, he'd been weaving a fragile web of confidence, convincing himself this was a temporary hurdle. Justice was a game, he thought, one he could still win. Power was still his ally, and this courtroom was just a stage for a minor delay before he walked free, plotting his next move. But he was wrong. Danielle could sense it, a shift in the room, an unshakable certainty, the weight of a system finally forced to confront the truth head-on. High above them, the judge's nod was a silent command. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked, her voice steady, slicing through the tension. A woman in the front row rose, clutching a folded piece of paper. Her hands were steady, her expression unreadable, her voice clear as crystal. "We have, Your Honor." The paper passed from her hands to the judge's, each movement deliberate, precise. The judge unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words with a flicker of intensity. Danielle watched her closely, noting the subtle tightening of her lips, the careful way her gaze traced each line. Then the judge looked up, her voice ringing with a finality that filled every corner of the room. "In the matter of Travis Mitchell versus the City of Brookhaven and Chief Marcus Carter, regarding wrongful termination, defamation, An abuse of power. The jury finds in favor of the defense. A moment of stillness gripped the room. Then a wave of sound broke free: murmurs, gasps, the rustle of movement. Relief washed through the crowd, not as celebration but as release. Danielle exhaled slowly, her breath measured, her heart steady. Marcus closed his eyes for a fleeting second, letting the weight of the moment settle, the reality sinking in. Mitchell sat frozen, his hands clamped to the edge of the table, his face twisting into something raw and unreadable. The judge pressed on, her voice unwavering. Furthermore, regarding Officer Mitchell's countersuit for reputational damage, the court finds no basis for financial compensation. The plaintiff's request is denied in full. The words landed like a hammer. Mitchell's body sagged, the fight draining from him, though his mind refused to surrender. The moment stretched, heavy and absolute, his defeat sinking deep, suffocating him in a way he'd never imagined. His lawyer's face betrayed the truth. He knew the battle was lost. Mitchell, though, wasn't ready to accept it. His fingers twitched against the table, his jaw clenching so tightly a muscle pulsed in his cheek. "This is," he muttered, the words barely audible. But they carried a venom that Danielle and Marcus felt. The entire room felt. The judge's voice cut through like a blade. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her tone sharp, unyielding, "you will respect this court and its ruling. I will not warn you again." His eyes snapped up, blazing with defiance. But he said nothing. For the first time, he had no words, no power, no ground to stand on. The judge turned to the defense table, her tone softening but still firm. "Chief Carter, you and your department were justified in the actions taken against Mr. Mitchell. This court finds no wrongdoing in your decision to terminate his employment, nor in your handling of the incident that led to it. As of this ruling, all legal claims made by Mr. Mitchell against you and the city are officially dismissed." Marcus inclined his head, his composure unbroken. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. The gavel struck the wood with a sharp crack, and the words followed: "Court is adjourned." The room erupted into motion. Reporters scrambled, already crafting their headlines. Lawyers exchanged handshakes, files snapped shut, and whispers filled the air as people processed the weight of what had just unfolded. Danielle rolled her shoulders, letting relief seep into her bones, not as victory, not as triumph, but as the quiet certainty that justice had prevailed, at least for today. Marcus turned on to her, and for the first time in months, a faint, weary smile curved his lips. Their eyes met, and Danielle reached out, her fingers brushing his. He clasped her hand briefly, a silent anchor in the chaos. Across the room, Mitchell rose slowly, his movements stiff, as if his body resisted the truth his mind refused to accept. His lawyer muttered something, but Mitchell didn't seem to hear. He turned toward the exit, his steps heavy, his world crumbling around him. Yet in his mind, this wasn't the end. He still saw himself as the victim, the one wronged by a system that dared to hold him accountable. Danielle watched him go, her expression steady, unreadable. Then she turned back to Marcus. "It's done," she murmured. Marcus exhaled, his gaze flickering to the doors where Mitchell had vanished. "No," he said softly, his voice tinged with quiet resolve. "But it's over." Danielle nodded, understanding perfectly. Justice hadn't erased the past. It didn't undo the grief that had lingered in the diner, the fear in their daughter Mia's eyes, or the years of power abused, the silent suffering of those who never got their day in court. But it was a step, a solid, unyielding step forward, and they would take it together. When they returned home, the house was quiet, but it wasn't the oppressive silence that had clung to them for weeks, heavy with worry and waiting, like a storm that refused to break. This was different, soft, warm, a quiet born of relief. Marcus unlocked the door, stepping inside first, loosening his tie with a slow, deliberate motion, as if shedding the weight of the day. Danielle followed, closing the door gently behind her, her body still carrying the tension of the trial but no longer bowed by fear or uncertainty. For a moment, they stood in the stillness, letting the peace of home wrap around them, feeling the absence of the battle that had consumed them. Then a small voice broke the silence, cautious and hesitant. Is it over? Mia stood at the edge of the hallway, still in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. Her wide eyes darted between her parents, searching for answers. Danielle's heart clenched. She glanced at Marcus, a silent understanding passing between them. They had won, but their daughter had carried the weight of this fight too. Danielle crouched down, opening her arms. Come here, baby. Mia hesitated for only a heartbeat before running forward, throwing herself into her mother's embrace, her grip fierce, desperate. Danielle held her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead, breathing in the warmth of her, the fragility of her innocence that had been tested but not broken. Marcus knelt beside them, his hand resting gently on Mia's back, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. It's over, he said, and the words carried a truth that settled deep. Mia pulled back slightly, blinking up at him. Really, Danielle nodded, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. Really. Mia let out a small breath, a mix of relief and uncertainty, then frowned, her hands still clutching her mother's sleeve. What happens now? Danielle glanced at Marcus, then back to Mia, her hand smoothing down her daughter's back. We go back to normal, she said softly. Mia tilted her head, her small brows furrowing. Like before, Danielle hesitated, then shook her head. No, she admitted, her voice gentle but honest. Not like before. Mia considered this, her expression thoughtful, not thin, just curious. After a moment, she nodded. Okay. Marcus exhaled, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he reached out, pulling Mia into his arms and standing up. She nestled against his shoulder, small and safe, wrapped in the strength of a father who had carried an impossible burden but never let her see it. Danielle watched them, a quiet peace settling in her chest. They weren't untouched by what had happened, nor unchanged, but they were okay. Marcus turned, his free hand reaching for Danielle's, pulling her close. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, a silent promise passing between them. Danielle closed her eyes, letting herself feel it, the warmth, the end of one chapter, the beginning of another. For the first time in weeks, the weight was gone. They were just a family, no courtrooms, no battles, just them. The case didn't vanish from the headlines overnight. Debates lingered. Voices still argued, some refusing to accept the verdict, unwilling to face the truth laid bare. But it didn't matter. The department felt the shift. Officers who had watched in silence, who had doubted or stayed neutral, now saw the truth power could no longer shield those who abused it. Change came slowly, but it came. Complaints once ignored were now investigated. Officers once untouchable faced scrutiny. The badge no longer granted immunity to those who believed it placed them above the law. And Mitchell. He was gone, disgraced, a fading name in a case that would outlive his legacy. Justice had done its work, and that was enough. The world moved on. But for Marcus, Danielle, and Mia, the victory wasn't in the headlines or the debates. It was in the quiet of their home, in the warmth of their family, in the knowledge that they had faced the storm and emerged stronger, together.